Well, I am Tina Ha, and a couple warm-up questions for all of you. How many of you, raise of hands, have ever heard of the Millennial Generation? All right. How many of you have ever managed a millennial employee or worked with a millennial employee? Okay. How many of you would identify yourself as part of the Millennial Generation or a millennial employee? Okay. By definition. So my question that I wanted to look at for the catwalk focused on millennial employees. Specifically, the question was, what key strategies could managers use to motivate high productivity in millennial employees? So let me take a moment to do a couple of definitions. Millennial, based on research, it's loosely noted that research contradicts the start and the end date of when the generation actually begins and ends, but an accepted time frame is 1980 to 2000. So any individual that falls into kind of that time range is actually considered a millennial employee, or a millennial employee. And then generation is also noted in a research study, which I felt was a good definition, was Costanza in 2012. He kind of noted that generation is an individual that shares an experience at a same age of different historical events, social phenomenon, or tragedies. So you kind of it's a loose definition of generation. Why is all of that important, and how does the data and the research that I did relate to my question? The data and the research that I found, I looked at two different research studies. One was a meta-analysis on generational differences in workplace attitudes. The other was a review of empirical evidence, also related to generational differences in workplace attitudes. They both found, as they studied job satisfaction within generational employees, whether it was baby boomers, Generation X, or millennials, they found no specific connection to job satisfaction, intent to turn over, job performance. What I found very interesting in those two areas of research is that when you look at strategies, there's not empirical research or empirical evidence to suggest that there's specific strategies out there to target motivation for millennial employees. What's interesting about that is that popular culture and popular media would probably tell you otherwise. There's a lot of research, and there's a lot, or they're not a research, but there's a lot of publication out there about millennials. So all of you kind of said, oh yeah, I've heard of millennials and I've heard of millennial employees, and I even identify with that generation. And you could probably say even that you would say, well, I've been told that if I manage millennial employees, this is what I should do. But interestingly enough, there's not empirical evidence, or in the meta-analysis, there's not quantitative data that actually support those strategies. So what's interesting when you ask that question, when I asked that question, I found it very intriguing, because the answer to the question essentially is, what are the key strategies to motivate high productivity in millennial employees? The key strategies are not any different to what you would motivate high productivity in any employee, not necessarily a millennial employee, because the data doesn't support that those strategies need to target millennial employees. There are individual research studies that have studied job performance of millennial employees, what companies are doing to target productivity and job performance of millennial employees, but they're only specific research studies, and they're not in a greater body of research. So that lends me to the limitations of some of what I talked about in looking at this research for my question, is that the millennial generation, and why this is important, I think, as we move into it, is the millennial employee in the millennial generation is the largest workforce starting to move into entry-level jobs. 90 million millennials are starting to move into the workforce, starting in 2004. But they've started in 2004 to enter the workforce, therefore there's not a lot of really extensive bodies of research to look at in the data doesn't necessarily correlate to job performance for millennial employees. So that was my conclusion, was essentially the strategies that managers need to implement is to first know your employee, whether they're millennial, a baby boomer, or a Gen Xer. That doesn't throw out that there may be characteristics of that generation where generational differences do come into play. But there isn't something that in the research supports a best practice for strategies for managers.
Basically, so why is this such a stereotype then?
Because of popular media.
Okay.
Because, you know, like there was a Times article, I think in 2010, that talked about the Me generation.
Yeah.
So many popular popular media outlets, everybody studied the millennial generation because this is the largest generation to move into the workforce. But what they've done, at least in their research, what it talked about in these two, and I was blown away actually, in the two meta-analysis and the empirical review, they said, but if you look at the data, it doesn't support the stereotype. The stereotype has been created, and a perception of the generation has been created as they move into the workforce. But if you look at them in the workforce, they don't have any generational different. Job satisfaction to them is not statistically that much different than what a Generation X employee is looking for, or even a baby boomer is looking for. They still want work-life balance. They still want a salary. So there's not indications of that much difference, but the perception that they want something different is out there. It's interesting.
Yeah, I got a huge argument with somebody over that because I was like, it's such a stereotype about the millennial generation, how we're motivated.
Mm-hmm.
Need you there.
Yeah, I mean, the research, the empirical, I mean, they looked at 329 studies in this meta-analysis, and then they narrowed it down to 95 quantitative studies. And every single one of them did not make any support, or if the support was there, so many of the studies contradicted each other. It was really fascinating when I was doing the research.
Sorry to mention this, but was there any kind of explanation of if there's a correlation between quote unquote millennials and like the increase in technology and how that kind of affects everything?
Yes. So the studies talked about how characteristics or attributes of a generation of an employee come into play in the workplace. But when it comes to motivation, let me put it this way. A millennial employee is not going to work for a company because they're not technologically savvy. They're going to work for a company because they're interested in working for that company, they have a good salary, but they're going to come in having a skill set that they're very technologically savvy. So there was reference to that, but it wasn't correlated to performance.
So if I would have an employee, if I would be a manager and having an employee, what would you recommend to motivate them?
To motivate them?
Mm-hmm.
I think, again, you as a manager, you work on the best practice that's out there in creating performance development plans, getting to know your employee. What makes them motivated? So if they come in as a millennial employee, assuming that they want mentoring, constant feedback, technology, that may not be what they want. So asking the questions up front, and a lot of what you know has been mentioned about mentoring, leadership style, so connecting with them on more of a personal level and understanding what motivates them is more important than coming in with a stereotype and assuming that this is what they need to be motivated.
This isn't a question, it's actually just a statement, but
Stayed away.
I was thinking about the technologically savvy. So I've worked for companies before that are not. And I will never work for a company again that is not technologically savvy. So it's more of a statement than anything, but it's interesting because probably at first, they're like, wow, this sounds cool, and I like this company, and they have this benefit. But then when you get in there and they are not up to date, whether their processes are automated or whatever the case might be, I think it can definitely change the perspective over time.
And this is not based on the research, but what's interesting to your statement is that I think, and this is more my opinion, kind of based on some of what I read, is that companies are looking at their recruitment. Like what do they need in their employees? So if they need to become up to date, what they're looking for is employees that are technologically savvy, which can loosely correlate to job satisfaction, because regardless of generation, if you go into a company and you feel needed and you feel like you can contribute and you're valuable, you could loosely correlate that to output and performance, because you're like, okay, I have something to offer, and the company sees you as a valuable asset. So when you talk about companies that are not technologically savvy, those are the companies that need to consider, well, what employees can we hire that do have that strength? And when you talk about millennial employees that are going into the workforce, they maybe need to focus a little bit more on selling those traits if they're strengths. But I think that's fascinating too, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tina.
Oh, yeah.